Chapter 3 Settling the English Colonies, 1619 through 1700. Virginia marked the first enduring English foray onto the continent of North America in 1607. With decades, English settlements would be creeping inland from Charleston to Boston. They would be as diverse as the people who populated them, even though they shared a common language and allegiance to Mother England. The southern colonies, blessed with warm weather and marketable crops, soon developed export economies that linked them to the greater British Empire and stimulated a growing dependence on unfree labor. In northern colonies, from the fertile valleys of Middle Atlantic to the rocky shores of New England, families of immigrants founded communities defined more by disputes over religion than the pursuit of profits. For Native Americans all along the eastern seaboard, the advantage of large-scale English colonization brought trade, both disease, war, and dislocation. Though the first Virginian colonists had waded ashore in hopes of finding gold and jewels lying about the forests of the Chesapeake, they soon learned that such treasures were not to be found. The settlers cast about for some other means of making their enterprise profitable until they hit upon tobacco. John Rolfe, the husband of the Pocahontas, became father to the tobacco industry and an economic savior of the Virginia colony. By 1612, he had perfected methods of raising and curing the pungent weed, eliminating much of the bitter tang. Soon the European demand for tobacco was nearly insatiable. A tobacco rush swept over Virginia as the crops were planted in the streets of Jamestown and even between the numerous graves. So exclusively did the colonists concentrate on planting the yellow leaf that first they had to import some from their foodstuffs. Colonists who had once hungered for food now hungered for land, even more land on which to plant ever more tobacco. Relentlessly they pressed the frontier of settlement up the river valleys to the west, abrasively edging against the Indians. Virginia's prosperity was finally built on tobacco smoke. This bewitching weed played a vital role in putting the colony on firm economic foundations, but tobacco, King Nicotine, was somewhat of a tyrant. It was ruinous on the soil and greedily planted in successive years, and enchained the fortunes of Virginia to the fluctuating price of a single crop. Fatefully, tobacco also promoted the broad-acred plantation system, and was a brisk demand for fresh labor. In 1619, the year before the Plymouth Pilgrims landed in New England, what was described as a Dutch warship appeared off Jamestown and sold some 20 Africans. The scanty record does not reveal whether they were purchased as lifelong slaves or as servants committed to limited years of servitude. However, it transpired that simple commercial transaction planted the seeds of North American slave system. Yet enslaved blacks were too costly for most of hard-pinched white colonists to acquire, and for decades few were brought to Virginia. In 1650, Virginia counted but 300 people of African descent. Although by the end of the century, blacks, most of them enslaved, made up approximately 14% of the colony's population. Representative self-government was also born in primitive Virginia, in the same cradle with slavery in the same year, 1619. The Virginia Company authorized the settlers to summon an assembly known as the House of Burgesses. A momentous precedent was thus feebly established for this assemblage, which was the first of many miniature parliaments to flourish in the soil of America. King James I deeply distrusted it, however branding it a cemetery of sedition. In 1624 he revoked the charter of the bankrupt and beleaguered Virginia Company and made Virginia a royal colony directly under his control. Maryland, the second plantation colony, but the fourth English colony to be planted, was founded in 1634 by Lord Baltimore, a prominent English Catholic family. He embarked upon the venture partly to reap financial profits and partly to create a refuge for its fellow Catholics. Protestant England was still persecuting Roman Catholics, among numerous discriminations. A couple seeking wedlock could not be legally married by a Catholic priest. Absentee proprietor Lord Baltimore hoped that 200 settlers who founded Maryland at St. Mary's on Chesapeake Bay would be the vanguard of a vast new federal domain. Huge estates were to be awarded to his largely Catholic relatives in gracious manor houses, modeled on those of England's aristocracy, were intended to arise amidst the fertile forests. As in Virginia, colonists proved willing to come only if offered the opportunity to acquire land of their own. Soon they were dispersed around Chesapeake region on modest farms, and had the haughty land barons, mostly Catholic, were surrounded by resentful back-country planters, mostly Protestant. Resentment flared into the rebellion near the end of the century, and the Baltimore family for a time lost its proprietary rights. Despite these tensions, Maryland proposed. Like Virginia, it blossomed forth in acres of tobacco. Also, like Virginia, it depended for labor in its early years, mainly on white indentured servants, penniless persons who bound themselves to work a number of years to pay their passage. In both colonies, it was only in the later years of the 17th century that black slaves became to be imported in large numbers. Lord Baltimore, a canny soul, permitted unusual freedom of the worship at the outset. He hoped that the fellow would thus purchase toleration for his own fellow worshippers. But the heavy tide of Protestants threatened to submerge the Catholics and place severe restrictions on them, as in England. Faced with the disaster, the Catholics of Maryland threw their support behind the famed Act of Toleration, which had been passed in 1649 by the local representative assembly. Maryland's new religious statute guaranteed toleration to all Christians, but rather less liberally it decreed the death penalty for those, like Jews and atheists, who deny the divinity of Jesus. The law thus sanctioned less toleration than had previously existed in the settlement, but also extended a temporary cloak of protection to the uneasy Catholic minority, one result which that when the colonial era ended, Maryland probably sheltered more Roman Catholics than any other English-speaking colony in the New World. While the English were planting the first frail colonial shoots in the Chesapeake, they were also brutally colonizing the islands of the West Indies. Spain, weakened by the military overextension and distracted by its rebellious Dutch provinces, relaxed its grip on much of the Caribbean in the early 1600s. By the mid-17th century, England had secured its claim to the several West Indian islands, including the large prize of Jamaica in 1655. Sugar formed the foundation of the West Indian economy. What tobacco was to the Chesapeake, sugar cane was to the Caribbean, with one crucial difference. Tobacco was a poor man's crop. It could be planted easily, it produced commercially marketable leaves within a year, and it required only simple processing. Sugarcane, in contrast, was a rich man's crop. It had to be planted extensively to yield commercially viable quantities of sugar. Expensive planting, in turn, required extensive and arduous land clearing, and the cane stalks yielded their sugar only for an elaborate process of refining in a sugar mill. The need for land and for the labor to clear it and to run mills made sugar cultivation a capital-intensive business. Only wealthy growers with abundant capital to invest could succeed in sugar. The sugar lords extended their dominion over to the West Indies in the 17th century. To work on their sprawling plantations, they imported enormous numbers of enslaved Africans, more than 250,000 in the 5 decades after 1640. But around the 1700s, enslaved black outnumber the white settlers in the English West Indies by nearly 4 to 1. And the religion's population has remained predominantly black ever since. West Indians thus take their place among the numerous children of the African diaspora, the vast scattering of the African peoples throughout the New World. In 3.5 centuries following Columbus' discovery, to control this large and potentially restive slave population, English authorities devised formal codes that defined the slaves' legal status and their masters' prerogatives. The notorious Barbados Slave Code of 1661 denied even the most fundamental rights to slaves and gave their masters virtually complete control over their laborers, including the right to inflict vicious punishments for even slight infractions. The profitable sugar plantation system soon crowded out almost all other forms of Caribbean agriculture. The West Indies increasingly depended on the North American mainland for foodstuffs and the other basic supplies. And other small English farmers, squeezed out by the greedy sugar barons, began to migrate to the newly founded southern mainland colonies. A group of displaced English settlers from Barbados arrived in Carolina in 1670. They brought with them a few enslaved Africans as well as the model of the Barbados Slave Code, which eventually inspired statutes governing slavery throughout the mainland colonies. Carolina officially adopted a version of the Barbados Slave Code in 1696, just as the West Indies had been a testing ground for the encomienda system that the Spanish had brought to Mexico and South America. So the Caribbean islands now served as a staging area for the slave system that would take root elsewhere in English North America. Civil war convulsed England in the 1640s. King Charles I had dismissed Parliament in 1629, and when he eventually recalled it in 1640, the members were mutinous, finding their great champion in the Puritan soldier Oliver Cromwell. The ultimate beheading of Charles in 1649, and Cromwell ruled England for nearly a decade. The English Civil War ended when Charles II, son of the decapitated king, was restored to the throne in 1660. Colonization had been interrupted during this period of bloody unrest. Now, in the so-called Restoration period, empire building resumed with greater intensity, and the royal involvement. Carolina, named for Charles II, was formally created in 1670 after the king granted to 8 of his court favorites, the lords proprietors, an expanse of wilderness ribbing across the continent to the Pacific. These aristocratic founders hoped to grow foodstuffs to provision the sugar plantations in Barbados, and to export non-English products like wine, silk, and olive oil. Carolina proposed by developing close economic ties with flourishing sugar islands of the English West Indies. In a broad sense, the mainland England colony was both the most northerly of the outposts. Many original Carolina settlers, in fact, had immigrated from the Barbados, bringing the island's slave system with them. They also established vigorous slave trade in Carolina itself. Enlisting the aid of the coastal Savannah Indians, they forayed into the interior in search of captives. The lords proprietors in London protested against the Indian slave trading in their colony, but to no avail. Men-laced Indians soon were among the young colony's major exports. As many as 10,000 Indians were dispatched to lifelong labor in the West Indian cane fields and sugar mills. Along were sent to New England. One to Rhode Island town in 1730 counted more than 200 enslaved Carolina Indians in the midst. In 1707, the Savannah Indians decided to end their alliance with the Carolinians and migrate to the back country of Maryland and Pennsylvania, where a new colony founded by Quakers under William Penn promised better relations between the whites and the Indians. But the Carolinas determined to thin in savannahs, but they could depart. A series of bloody raids but annihilated the Indian tribes of the coastal Carolina by 1710. After much experimentation, Rice emerged as the principal expert in Carolina. Rice was then an exotic food in England. No rice seeds were sent out from London in the first supply ships to Carolina. But rice was grown in Africa, and the Carolinians were soon paying premium prices for West African slaves experienced in the rice cultivation. The Africans' agricultural skill and their relative immunity to malaria, thanks to a good genetic trait, that also unfortunately made them and their descendants susceptible to sickle cell anemia, made them ideal laborers on the hot and swampy rice plantations. By 1710, they constituted a mortgage to the Carolinians. Moss festooned Charlestown, also named for the king, rapidly became the busiest seaport in the South. Many high-spirited sons of England landed families, deprived of an inheritance, came to Charleston area and gave it a rich aristocratic flavor. The village became a colorful, diverse community to which French Protestant refugees, Jews, and others were attracted to the religious toleration. Nearby in Florida, the Catholic Spaniards abhorred the intrusion of these Protestant heretics. Carolina frontier was often aflame. Aided by Indian allies, sword-wielding and armor-clad Spanish warriors attempted to push the England out of Carolina in successive Anglo-Spanish wars, but by the 1700s, Carolina was too strong to be wiped out. The wild northern expanse of the huge Carolina giant Grant bordered on Virginia. From the older colony there drifted down a ragtag group of poverty-stricken outcasts and religious dissenters. Many of them had been repelled by the rarefied atmosphere of Virginia, dominated as it was a big plantation gentry belonging to the Church of England. North Carolinians, as a result, have been called the quintessence of Virginia's discontent. The newcomers, who frequently were squatters without legal rights to the soil, raised their tobacco and other crops on small farms, which leave little need for slaves. Distinctive traits developed rapidly in North Carolina. The poor but sturdy inhabitants, regarded as a riffraff by their snobbish neighbors, and a reputation for being irreligious and hospitable to pirates. Isolated from neighbors by raw wilderness and stormy Cape Hatteras, graveyard of the Atlantic, the northern Carolinians developed a strong spirit of resistance to authority. Their location between Acristia, Virginia, and Acristic, South Carolina, caused the area to be dubbed a Vale of Humility between the two mountains of Conceit. Following much friction with governors, North Carolina was officially separated from South Carolina in 1712, and subsequently each segment became a royal colony. Although Northern Carolina, unlike the colony's southern reaches, did not at first import large numbers of African slaves, both regions shared on the ongoing tragedy of bloody relations between the Indians and Europeans. Tuscarora Indians fell upon the fledgling settlement of New Bern in 1711. The North Carolinians, aided by their heavily armed brothers from the south, retaliated by crushing the Indians in the Tuscarora War, selling hundreds of them into slavery and leaving the survivors to wander northward to seek the protections of the Iroquois. The Tuscaroras eventually became the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. The fate of the Tuscaroras, together with the persistent activities of the British slave traders in the Indian country, led to another war 4 years later, in which the South Carolinians defeated and dispersed the Yamasee Indians. But the conquest of the Yemenis, virtually all the coastal Indian tribes in the southern colonies had been utterly devastated by about 1720. Yet the interior, near the hills and the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, the powerful Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw remained stronger and more numerous than their coastal cousins. They managed for half a century more to contain British settlement to the coastal plain east of the mountains. Pine Forest, Georgia, with the harbor of the Savannah nourishing its chief settlement, was formally founded in 1733. It proved to be the last of the 13 mainland colonies to be planted, 126 years after the first Virginia, and 52 years after the 12th Pennsylvania. Chronologically, Georgia belongs elsewhere, but geographically, it may be grouped with its southern neighbors. The English crown intended Georgia to serve chiefly as a buffer, and it would protect the more valuable Carolinas against the vengeful Spaniards in Florida, against the hostile French from Louisiana. Georgia indeed suffered much buffeting, especially when wars broke out between Spain and England in the European arena. As a vital link in imperial defense, they exposed the colony received monetary subsidy from the British government at the outset, but only one of the original 13 to enjoy this benefit in its founding stage. Named in the honor of King George II of England, Georgia was launched by a high-minded group of the philanthropists. In addition to protecting their neighboring northern colonies and producing silk and wine, they were determined to carve out a haven for wretched souls imprisoned for debt. They were also determined, at least at first, to keep slavery out of Georgia. The ab least of the founders was the dynamic soldier-statesman George Agarthorpe, who became keenly interested in prison reform after one of his friends died in a debtor's jail. As a competent military leader, Agarthorpe repelled Spanish attacks. As an imperialist and a philanthropist, he saved the charity colony. By his energetic leadership and by heavily mortgaging his own personal fortune, the hamlet of Savannah, like Charleston, was a melting pot community. German Lutherans and kilted Scots Highlanders, among others, added color to the pattern. All Christian worshippers except Catholics enjoyed religious toleration. Many missionaries armed with Bibles and hope arrived in Savannah to work among debtors and Indians. Prominent among them was young John Wesley, who later returned to England and founded the Methodist Church. Georgia grew with painful slowness and at the end of the colonial era was perhaps the least populous of the colonies. The development of a plantation economy was thwarted by an unhealthy climate, by early restrictions on black slavery, and by demoralizing Spanish attacks. Certain distinctive features were shared by England's southern mainland colonies: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Broad-acred, these outspots of empire were all in some degree devoted into exporting commercial agricultural products, profitable staple crops, and the rural, notably tobacco and rice. Though to a lesser extent in small form North Carolina, slavery was found in all the plantation colonies, though only after 1750 in a reformed-minded Georgia. Immense acreage in the hands of a favored few fostered a strong aristocratic atmosphere, except in North Carolina and to some extent in a debtor-tinged Georgia. The wide scattering of plantations and farms, often along the stately rivers, retarded the growth of cities and made the establishment of churches and schools both difficult and expensive. In 1671, the governor of Virginia actually thanked God that no free schools or printing presses existed in his colony. All the plantation colonies permitted some religious toleration. The tax-supported Church of England became the dominant faith. though it was the weakest of the nonconformist North Carolina. These colonies were in some degree expansivary. Soil butchery by expensive tobacco growing drove settlers westward, and the long, lazy rivers invited penetration of the continent and continuing confrontation with the Native Americans. Little did the German friar Martin Luther expect, when he nailed his protestants against the Catholic doctrines to the door of Wittenberg's cathedral in 1517, that he was shaping the destiny of a yet unknown nation, particularly in New England, where religious devotion, not worldly wealth, profoundly shaped the earliest settlements, denouncing the authority of priests and popes. Luther declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's Word. He ignited a fire of religious reform, the Protestant Reformation, that licked its way across Europe for more than a century, dividing peoples, toppling sovereigns, and kindling the spiritual fervor of millions of men and women, some whom built communities that would eventually become America. The reforming flame burned especially brightly in the bosom of John Calvin in Geneva. This somber and severe religious leader elaborated Martin Luther's idea in ways that profoundly affected the thought and character of the generations of Americans yet unborn. Calvinism became the dominant theological credo not only of the New England Puritans but also by American settlers as well, including the Scottish Presbyterians, French Huguenots, and communications of the Dutch Reformed Church. Calvin spread out his basic doctrine in a learned Latin tome of 1536, entitled The Institutes of Christian Religion. God, Calvin argued, was all-powerful and all-good. Humans became of the corrupting effect of original sin, were weak and wicked. God was also all-knowing, and he knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. Since the first moment of creation, some souls, the elect, have been destined for eternal bliss and others for eternal torment. Good works could not save those who predestination had marked for them eternal fires. But neither could the elect count on a predetermined salvation and lead the lives of the wild. Immoral abandon, for one thing, no one could be certain of his or her statutes in the heavenly ledger. Gnawing doubts about their eternal fate plagued Calvinists. Their sanity sought in themselves and others signs of conversion, or the receipt of God's free gift of saving grace. Conversion was thought of to be an intense, indifferable personal experience in which God revealed to their elect their heavenly destiny. Therefore, they were expected to lead sanctified lives, demonstrating by their holy behavior that they were among the visible saints. These doctrines swept into England just as King Henry VIII was breaking his ties with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s, making himself the head of the Church of England. Henry would have been content to retain Roman rituals and creeds, but his action powerfully stimulated some of the English religious reformers to undertake a total purification of the English Christianity. Many of these Puritans, as it happened, came from the commercially depressed woolen districts. Calvinism, with its message of stark but reassuring order in the divine plan, fed on this social unrest, provided spiritual comfort to the economically disadvantaged. As time went on, Puritans grew increasingly unhappy over the snail-like progress of the Protestant Reformation in England, though burned with furious zeal to see the Church of England wholly decatholicized. The most devout Puritans, including those eventually settled in New England, believed that the only visible saints, that is, persons who felt the streams of grace in their souls and could demonstrate its presence to their fellow Puritans, should be admitted to church membership. But the Church of England enrolled all the king's subjects, which meant that the saints had to share pews and communication rails with the damned. Appalled by this unholy fraternizing, a tiny group of dedicated Puritans, known as the Separatists, vowed to break away entirely from the Church of England. King James I, a shrewd Scotsman, was heard of both the state and Church of England in 1603 to 1625. He quickly perceived that if his subjects could defy him as their spiritual leader, that one day defy him as their political leader, as in fact they would later defy and behead his son Charles I. He therefore threatened to harass the more bothersome separatists out of their land. The most famous congregation of the separatists, fleeing royal wrath, departed for Holland in 1608. During the ensuing 12 years of toil and poverty, they were increasingly distressed in the Dutchification of their children. They longed to find a haven where they could live and die as English men and women and as purified Protestants. America was the logical refuge. Despite the early ordeals of Jamestown and the wild tales of the New World cannibals roasting steaks from their wild victims over open fires. A group of the separatists in Holland, after negotiating with the Virginia Company, at length secured rights to settle under its jurisdiction, but their crowded Mayflower, 65 days at sea, missed its destination and arrived off the stony coast of New England in 1620 with a total of 120 persons. One had died en route, an unusually short casualty list, and one had been born at a properly named Oceanus. Fewer than half of the entire party were separatists. Prominent among the non-belongers was a peppery and stocky soldier of fortune, Captain Miles Standish, dubbed by one of his critics Captain Shrimp. He later rendered indispensable service as an Indian fighter and negotiator. The Pilgrims did not make their initial landing at Plymouth Rock, as commonly supposed, but undertook a number of preliminary surveys. They finally chose for their best site the blustery coast of Plymouth Bay. The place was more hospitable than at first seemed, as its once wooded shores had been conveniently cleared by now departed native peoples. Making for an easier settlement, this area was outside the domain of the Virginia Company, and consequently the settlers became squatters. They were without legal right to the land and without specific authority to establish a government. Before disembarking, the Pilgrim leaders drew up and signed a brief Mayflower Compact. Although settling an invaluable precedent for later written constitutions, this document was not at all constitutional. It was a simple agreement to form a crude government and to submit the will of the major under the regulations agreed upon. The compact was signed by 41 adult males, 11 of them with the exalted rank of minister, though not by servants, and 2 seamen. The pact was a promising step toward genuine self-government, for soon the adult male settlers were assembling to make their own laws in open discussion town meetings, a vital laboratory of liberty. The Pilgrims' first winter of 1620 through 1621 took a grisly toll. Only 44 out of the 102 survived. At one time, only 7 were enough to lay dead on the frosty graves. Yet when the Mayflower sailed back to England in the spring, not a single one of the courageous band of separatists left. As one of them wrote, "It is not with us as with other men, whom shall things can discourage. God made his children prosperous, so the Pilgrims believed." The next autumn, that of 1621, brought bountiful harvest, and with them the first Thanksgiving Day in New England. In time, the frail colony found some economic legs in fur, fish, and lumber. The beaver and the Bible were early mainstays, the one for the subsistence of the body, the other for the subsistence of the soul. Plymouth proved that the English could maintain themselves in this uninviting region. The Pilgrims were extremely fortunate in their leaders, Prominent among them was the cultured William Bradford, a self-taught scholar who read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. He was chosen governor 30 times in annual elections. Among his major worries was his fear for independent, non-Puritan settlers on the particular might corrupt his godly experiment in the wilderness. Bustling fishing villages and other settlements did sprout out of north of Plymouth on the storm-lashed shores of Massachusetts Bay, where many people were such much interested in cod as God. Quiet and quaint, the little colony of Plymouth was never important economically or numerically. Its population numbered only 7,000 by 1691, when Stuart Charteris emerged with its giant neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the tidal settlement of Pilgrims was both morally and spiritually. The separatist Pilgrims were dedicated extremists, the purest Puritans. More moderate Puritans sought to reform the Church of England from within. Though resented by the bishops and monarchs, they slowly gathered support, especially in Parliament. But when Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1629 and sanctioned the anti-Puritan persecutions of the reactionary Archbishop William Laud, many Puritans saw catastrophe in the making. In 1629, an energetic group of non-separatist Puritans, fearing for their faith and for England's future, secured a royal charter in the form of Massachusetts Bay Company. They proposed to establish a sizable settlement in the infeudal Massachusetts area, which Boston soon becoming its hub, stealing a march on both king and church. The newcomers brought their character with them. For many years they used it as a kind of constitution, out of reach of royal authority. They steadfastly denied that they wanted to separate from the Church of England only from its impurities, but back in England, the highly orthodox Archbishop Laud snorted that the Bay Colony Puritans were swine rich-rooted in God's vineyard. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was singularly blessed. The well-equipped expedition of 1630, with 11 vessels carrying nearly 1,000 immigrants, started the colony off on a larger scale than any of the other English settlements. Continuing turmoil in England tossed up additional enriching waves of Puritan on the shores of Massachusetts in the following decade. During the Great English Migration of the 1630s, about 70,000 refugees left England, but not all of them were Puritans, and only about 20,000 came to the Massachusetts. Many were attracted to the warm and fertile West Indies, especially the sugar-rich island of Barbados. More Puritans came to the Caribbean insula than to all Massachusetts. Many fairly prosperous, educated persons immigrated to the Bay Colony, including John Winthrop, a well-to-do pillar of English society who became the colony's first governor. A successful attorney and the manor lord in England, Winthrop equally accepted to offer to become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believing that he had a calling from God to lead the new religious experiment. He served as governor or deputy governor for 19 years. The resources and skill of talented settlers like Winthrop helped Massachusetts prosper as fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding blossomed into important industries, especially fish and ships. The Massachusetts Bay Colony rapidly shot to the fore as both of the biggest and most influential of the New England outposts. Massachusetts also benefited from a shared sense of purpose. Among most of the first settlers, "We shall be a city upon a hill, a beacon to humanity," declared Governor Winthrop. A Puritan Bay colonist believed that they had the covenant with God, an agreement to build a holy society that would be a model for humankind. These common convictions deeply shared in the infant colony's life. Soon after the colonists' arrival, the franchise was extended to all freemen, adult males, who belonged to the Puritan congregations, which in time came to be called collectively the Congregational Church. Unchurched men remained voteless in provincial elections, as did all women. On this basis, about 2/5 of the adult males enjoy the right to vote in provincial affairs, a far larger proportion than in contemporary England. Town governments, which conducted much important business, were even more inclusive. These all male property holders, and in some cases other residents as well, enjoy the priceless boon of publicity, discussing local issues, often with much heat, and of voting on them by the majority rural show of hands. Yet the provincial government, liberal by the standards of the time, was not a democracy. The able governor Winthrop feared the distrusted the commons as the meaner sort, and thought the democracy was the meanest and worst of all forms of government. "If the peoples be governors," asked one of the Puritan clergymen, "who shall be governed?" True, the freemen annually elected the governor and his assistants, as well as a representative assembly called the General Court. But only Puritans, the visible saints, who alone were eligible for church membership, could be freemen. And according to the doctrine of the covenant, the whole purpose of the government was to enforce God's laws, which applied to believers and non-believers alike. Moreover, non-believers as well as believers paid taxes for the government-supported church. Religious leaders thus wielded enormous influences in the Massachusetts Bible Commonwealth. They powerfully influenced admission to the church membership by conducting public interrogations of persons claiming to have experienced conversion. Prominent among the early clergy was fiery John Conn, educated at English Cambridge University, a Puritan citadel. He immigrated to Massachusetts to avoid persecution for his criticism of the Church of England. In the Bay Colony, he devoted his considerable learning to defending the government's duty to enforce religious rules. But the power of the preachers was not absolute. A congregation had the right to hire and fire its minister and set his salary. Clergymen, who were also barred from holding formal political office, Puritans in England had suffered too much at the hands of a political Anglican clergy to permit the New World another unholy union of religious government power. In a limited way, the Bay colonists thus endorsed the idea of the separation of church and state. The Puritans were a worldly lot, despite or even because of the spiritual intensity. Like John Winthrop, they believed in a doctrine of calling to do God's work on earth. They shared in what was later called the Protestant ethic, which involved serious commitment to work and to engagement in worldly pursuits. The legends to the contrary, they also enjoyed simple pleasures. They ate plentifully, drank heartily, and sang songs occasionally, and made love most monogamously. Like other peoples of their time in both America and Europe, they passed laws and aimed at making sure these pleasures stayed simple, by repressing certain human instincts. In the New Haven, for example, a young married couple was fined 20 shillings for the crime of kissing in public. In later years, Connecticut came to be dubbed the Blue Law State. It was named so for the blue paper on which the repressive laws, also known as the supplementary laws, were printed. Yet to the Puritans, life was serious business, and hellfire was real, a hell where sinners shriveled and shrieked in vain for divine mercy, an immensely popular poem in New England, selling one copy for every 20 people, was clergyman Michael Wiggles' Worth Day of Doom, 1662. Especially horrifying were his descriptions of the fate of the damned. They cry, they roar for anguish sore, they gnaw their tongues for horror, but get away without delay. Christ pities not, you cry. Depart to hell, they may you yell and roar internally. The Bay Colony enjoyed a high degree of social harmony, stemming from common beliefs in its early years, but even in this tightly knit community, dissension soon appeared. Quakers who flouted the authority of the Puritan clergy were prosecuted with fines, flogging, and banishment. In one extreme case, 4 Quakers who defied expulsion, one of them a woman, were hanged on the Boston Common. A sharp challenge to Puritan orthodoxy came from Anne Hutchinson. She was an exceptionally intelligent, strong-willed, and outspoken woman, ultimately the mother of 14 children, swift and sharp in theological argument. She carried to logical extreme the Puritan doctrine of predestination. She claimed that a holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and that the truly saved need not to bother to obey the law of either God or man. This assertion, known as antimatheism, from the Greek against the law, was high heresy. Brought to trial in 1638, the quick-witted Hutchinson bamboozled her clerical inquisitors for days, until she eventually boasted that she had become her beliefs through a direct revelation from God. This was even higher heresy. The Puritan magistrates had little choice but to banish her. Lest she pollute the entire Puritan experiment, with her family she set out on foot for Rhode Island. Though pregnant, she finally moved to New York, where she and all of her houseboat were killed by Indians. Back in the Bay Colony, the pious John Winthrop saw God's hand in her fate. More threatening to the Puritan leaders was a personable and popular Salem minister, Roger Williams. Williams was a young man with radical ideas and an unrestrained tongue. An extreme separatist, he hounded his fellow clergymen to make a clean break with the corrupt Church of England. He also challenged the legality of the Bay Colony Charter, which he condemned for expropriating the land from the Indians without fair compensation. As if this were not enough, he went on to deny the authority of the civil government to regulate religious behavior and set it as the blow on the Puritan idea of the government's very purpose. Their patience exhausted by 1635, the Bay Colony authorities found William guilty of disseminating new and dangerous opinions, and ordered him banished. He was permitted to remain several months longer because of illness, but he kept up his criticisms. The outraged magistrates, fearing that he might organize a rival colony of malcontents, made plan to exile him to England, but Williams foiled them. Aided by friendly Indians, Roger Williams fled to the Rhode Island area in 1636. In the midst of a bitter winter at Providence, the courageous and far-visioned Williams built a Baptist church, probably the first in America. He established complete freedom of religion, even for Jews and Catholics. He demanded no oaths regarding religious beliefs, no compulsory attendance at worship, no taxes to support a state church. He even sheltered the abused Quakers, although disagreeing sharply with their views. William's endorsement of religious tolerance made Rhode Island more liberal than any of the other English settlements in the New World, and the most advanced than the most old-world communities as well. Those outcasts who clustered about Roger Williams enjoyed additional blessings. They exercised simple manhood suffrage from the start, though the broad-minded practice was later narrowed by a proprietary qualification opposed to special privilege of the sort. The interred Rhode Islanders managed to achieve remarkably freedom of opportunity. Other scattered settlements soon dotted Rhode Island. They consisted largely of malcontents and exiles, some who could not bear the stifling theological atmosphere of Bay Colony. Many of these restless souls in Rogues Island, including Anne Hutchinson, had little in common with Roger Williams, except being unwelcome anywhere else. The Puritan clergy back in Boston sneered at Rhode Island as a sewer in which the lower debris had collected and rotted. Planted by the discerners and exiles, Rhode Island became strongly individualistic and stubbornly independent. With good reason, Little Rhodey was later known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded. Began a squatter colony in 1636 without legal standing, It finally established rights to the soil when it became a secured of a charter from Parliament in 1644. A huge bronze statue of the independent man appropriately stands today in the dome of the State House in Providence. The smiling valley of the Connecticut River, one of the few highly fertile expanses of any size in New England, had meanwhile attracted a sprinkling of the Dutch and English settlers. Hartford was founded in 1635. The next year witnessed a spectacular beginning of the centuries-long westward movement across the continent. An energetic group of Boston Puritans led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker swarmed as a body into the Hartford area, with the ailing Mrs. Hooker carried on a horse litter. 3 years later, in 1639, the settlers of a new continent river colony drafted and opened a meeting a trailblazing document known as the Fundamental Orders. In effect, a modern constitution which established a regime democratically controlled by the substantial citizens. Essentially, features of the Fundamental Orders were later borrowed by the Connecticut for its colonial charter, and ultimately for its state constitution. Another flourishing Connecticut settlement began to spring up at New Haven in 1638. It was proposed that a community founded by Puritans who contrived to set up an even closer church-government alliance than in Massachusetts. Although only squatters without a charter, the colonists dreamed of making New Haven a bustling seaport, but they fell into disfavor with Charles II as a result of having sheltered two of the judges who had condemned his father, Charles I, to death. In 1662, to the acute distress of the New Havens, the Crown granted a charter of Connecticut that merged New Haven with the more democratic settlements of the Connecticut Valley. Far north, enterprising fishermen and fur traders had been active on the surf coast of Maine for a dozen or so years before the founding of Plymouth. After disheartening attempts of colonization in 1623 by Sir Ferdinand Gorges, this land and lakes for forests was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay after a formal purchase in 1677 from George's heirs. It remained a part of Massachusetts for nearly a century and a half before becoming a separate state. Granite-ribbed New Hampshire also sprang from the fishing and trading activities along the narrow coast. It was absorbed in 1641 by the grasping Bay Colony under a strained interpretation of the Massachusetts Charter. The king, annoyed by the display of greed, brutally separated New Hampshire from Massachusetts in 1679 and made it a royal colony. The spread of English settlements inevitably led to clashes with the Indians, who were particularly weak in New England. Shortly before the Pilgrims had arrived at Plymouth in 1620, an epidemic, probably triggered by the contact with English fishermen, had swept through the coastal tribes and killed more than 3/4 of the native people. Deserted Indian fields ready for tillage greeted the Plymouth settlers, and scattered skulls and bones provided the grim evidence of the impact of the disease. In no position to resist the English incursion, the local Wampanoag Indians at first befriended the settlers. Cultural accommodation was facilitated by the Tisquannon, who the colonists called Squanto, a Wampanoag who had learned English from a ship's captain who kidnapped him some years later. The Wampanoag chieftain Maciot signed a treaty with the Plymouth Pilgrims in 1621 and helped them celebrate the first Thanksgiving after the autumn harvest that same year. As more English settlers arrived and pushed into the Connecticut River Valley, confrontations between the Indians and the whites ruptured these peaceful relations. Hostilities exploded in 1637 between these English settlers and the powerful Pequot tribe. Basically, in a Pequot village on Connecticut's Mystic River, English military men and their Nasgernotts Indians allies set fire to the Indian wigwams and shot the fleeing survivors. The slaughter wrote a brutal finish to the Pequot War, virtually annihilated the Pequot tribe and engendered for decades of uneasy peace between the Puritans and the Indians. Lashed by critics in England, the Puritans made some feeble efforts at converting the remaining Indians to Christianity. Although Puritan missionary zeal never equaled that of the Catholic Spanish and French, A mere handful of the Puritans were gathered into Puritans' praying towns to make the acquaintance of the English God and learn the ways of the English culture. The Indians' only hope of resisting English encroachment lay banding together in the Pan-Indian Alliance against the swiftly spreading English settlements. In 1675, Maziot's son, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, forged such an alliance and mounted a series of coordinated assaults on English villages throughout New England. Frontier settlements were especially hit hard, and refugees fell back toward their relative safety on Boston. When the war ended in 1676, 52 Puritan towns had been attacked, and 12 destroyed entirely. Hundreds of colonists and many more Indians lay dead. Metacom's wife and son were sold into slavery. Him himself was captured, beheaded, and drawn and quartered. His head was carried on a pike back to Plymouth, where it was mounted on grisly display for years. Metacom's War, commonly referred as the King Philip's War, slowly westward marched on English settlement in New England for several decades. But the war inflicted a lasting defeat on New England's Indians, drastically reducing in numbers. Dispirited and disordered thereafter posted only sporadic threats to the New England colonists. The earliest North American colonies were founded with little oversight from London, and were largely left to their own pursuits as England descended into civil war in the 1640s. In 1643, 4 Puritan colonies in the New England balanced together to form the New England Confederation, meant primarily to serve as a military alliance against the Indians. French and Dutch in Confederation was an early experiment to intercolonial cooperation. Meant primarily to serve as a military alliance against the Indians, French and Dutch, the Confederation was an early experiment into intercolonial cooperation. When Charles II was restored to the English throne in 1660, the Crown took renewed interest in the colonies. To many colonists accustomed to making their own way in the New World, this was an unwelcome development. Royal authorities especially viewed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the comparative populous and strongly independent, as an sore needed of reigning in. As slap at Massachusetts, Charles II gave rival Connecticut in 1662 a sea-to-sea charter grant which legalized the several squatter settlements creeping up the Connecticut Valley. The very next year, the outcasts in Rhode Island also received a new charter, which gave knightly sanction to the most religiously tolerated government yet devised in America. A final and crushing blow fell the stiff-necked Bay Colony in 1684, where its precious charter was revoked by London authorities. Charles II's heir, James II, continued his brother's agenda. James sought to enforce the navigation laws, parliamentary acts designed to eliminate competition for colonial trade from the French, Dutch, and Spanish. Colonists resented limits being put on trade, and these acts inaugurated a century of smuggling on the part of American settlers. James II's reign would be short-lived as the English dethroned the despotic and unpopular Catholic royal and instead crowned the Protestant rulers of the Netherlands, the Dutch-born William III, and his English wife Mary II, daughter of James II. Massachusetts, suffering under the rule of James II, intensified when the Crown created the Dominion of New England in 1686. Embracing all the New England and expanded into New York and New Jersey, the Dominion placed English commander Sir Edmund Andros in charge of the vast swath of colonial territory, imposing from a fair committed to cutting down the colonial smuggling, and led by the tactless Andros, the Dominion generated waves of resentment in the northern colonies. Andros flaunted his non-Puritan religion, revoked land titles, and suppressed town meetings, courts, the press, and schools. When the English overthrew King James II, a Boston mob, catching the fever, seized the moment to drive Andros back to England. He tried to flee in woman's clothing, but the boots beneath his dress betrayed him. England's Glorious Revolution, which brought William and Mary to the English throne and restored Protestantism as the faith of English monarchs, reverberated throughout the colonies from New England to Chesapeake. Inspired by the challenge to a despotic ruler in Old England, many colonists seized the occasion to strike against the arbitrary royal authority in America. Unrest rocked by New York and Maryland from 1689 to 1691 until newly appointed royal governors restored a semblance of order. Most importantly, the new monarchs relaxed the royal grip on colonial trade, inaugurating a period of slaughtery neglect, which the much resented navigation laws were only weakly enforced. Yet, residues remained of Charles II's effort to assert tighter administrative control over his empire. More English officials, judges, clerks, customs officials, now staffed by the courts and strolled by the wharves of English America, many were incompetent. Corrupt hacks knew little and cared less of American affairs. Appointed by influential patrons in far-off England, they blocked the rise of local leaders in positions of political power by their very presence. Aggravated, Americans viewed them with mounting contempt and resentment to the 18th century wore on. A remarkable group of dissenters, commonly known as Quakers, arose in England during the mid-1600s. The name derived from the report that they quaked when under religious emotion. Officially, they were known as the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers were especially offensive to the authorities, both religious and civil. They refused to support the established Church of England with taxes. They built simple meeting houses, congregated without a paid clergy, and spoke up themselves in meetings when moved. Believing that they were all children in the sight of God, they kept their broad-brimmed hats on in the presence of their betters, and addressed others with simple thees and thous rather than the conventional titles. They would take no oaths because Jesus had commanded swear not to at all. This peculiarity often embroiled them with the government officials for test oaths. We were required to establish the fact that a person was not a Roman Catholic. The Quakers, beyond a doubt, were people of deep conviction. They abhorred strife and warfare and refused military service. As advocates of passive resistance, they would turn the other cheek and rebuild their meeting house on the site where their enemies had torn it down. Their courage and devotion to principle finally triumphed. Although at times they seemed stubborn and unreasonable, they were simple, devoted, democratic people, contending in their freedom own high-minded way of religious and civic freedom. William Penn, a well-born and athletic young Englishman, was attracted to the Quaker faith in 1660 when only 16 years old. His father disapprovingly administered a sound flogging. After various adventures in the army, the best portrait of the peaceful Quaker shows him in armor. The youth firmly embraced the despised faith and suffered much persecution. The courts branded him a saucy and impertinent fellow. Several hundred of his less fortunate fellow Quakers died of cruel treatment, and thousands more were fined, flogged, or cast in dank prisons. Penn's thoughts turned the New World, where a sprinkling of Quakers had already fled, notably to Rhode Island. North Carolina and New Jersey, eager to establish an asylum for his people, he also hoped to experiment with liberal ideas in his government and at the same time make a profit. Finally, in 1681, he managed to secure from the king an emergency grant of fertile land, in consideration of monetary debt owed to his deceased father by the crown. The king called the area Pennsylvania, Penn's Woodland, in honor of the sire. The modest son, fearing that critics would accuse him of naming it after himself, sought unsuccessfully to change the name. Pennsylvania was far the best advertised of the colonies. Its founder, the first American advertising man, sent out paid agents distributing countless pamphlets printed in English, Dutch, French, and German unlike the lures of many other American real estate promoters. Then, at later, Penn's endorsements were generally truthful. He especially welcomed forward-looking spirits and substantial citizens, including industrious carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and other manual workers. His liberal land policy, which encouraged substantial holdings, was instrumental in attracting a heavy inflow of immigrants. Penn formally launched his colony in 1681. His tack was simplified to the presence of several thousand squatters, Dutch, Swedish, English, Welsh, who were already scattered along the banks of Delaware River. Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love in Greek, was more carefully planned than most colonial settlements, and a sharp contrast of the Old World. Penn's grid of wide, attractive streets and the town squares became major influence on American cities to come. Penn described it as a Greenwich community town A. Penn farsightedly brought land from the Indians, including Chief Tammany, later patron saint of New York's political Tammany Hall. His treatment of the native appearance was so fair that the Quaker broad-brims went among them unarmed, and even employed them to mind their children. For a brief period, Pennsylvania seemed to the promised lands of biblical Indian-white relations. Some southern tribes even migrated to Pennsylvania, seeking the Quaker haven. But ironically, Quaker tolerance provided the undoing of Quaker Indian policy, as a non-Quaker European immigrants flooded into the province. They undermined the Quakers' own benevolent policy towards Indians. These feisty Scotch-Irish were particularly unpersuaded by Quaker idealism. Penn's new proprietary regime was unusually liberal. It included a representative assembly elected by landowners. No tax-supported state church drained coffers or demanded allegiance. Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all residents, although Penn, under pressure from London, was forced to deny Catholics and Jews the privilege of voting and holding the office. The death penalty was imposed only for treason and murder, as compared with some 200 capital crimes in England. Among other noteworthy features, no provision was made by the peace-loving Quakers of Pennsylvania for a military defense. No restrictions were placed on immigration, and neutralization was made easy. The humane Quakers early developed a strong dislike of black slavery, though the institution persisted in Pennsylvania as all in the other English colonies. With its many liberal features, Pennsylvania attracted a rich mix of ethnic groups. They included numerous religious misfits who were repelled by the harsh practices of neighboring colonies. This Quaker refuge boasted a surprisingly modern atmosphere in an unmodern age, and to an unusual degree afforded economic opportunity, civil liberty, and religious freedom. Even so, blue laws prohibited ungoodly revelry, stage plays, playing cards, dice games, and excessively hilarity. Under such generally happy auspices, Penn's brain-child grew lustlessly. The Quakers were shrewd business people, and in a short time the settlers were exporting grain and other foodstuffs. Within 2 years, Philadelphia claimed 300 and 2,500 people. Within 19 years, by 1700, the colony was surpassed in population and wealth only by long-established Virginia and Massachusetts. William Penn, who altogether spent about 4 years in Pennsylvania, who was never fully appreciated by his colonists. His governors, some of them incompetent and tactless, quarreled bitterly with the people, who were consistently demanding greater political control. Penn himself became too friendly with James II, the deposed Catholic king. Thrice arrested for treason, thrust for a time in debtor's prison, and afflicted a paralytic stroke, he died full of sorrows. His enduring monument was not only a noble experiment in government, but also a new commonwealth. based on civil and religious liberty and dedicated to freedom of conscience and worship, it held aloft a helpful torch in a world of semi-darkness. Small Quaker settlements flourished next door to Pennsylvania. New Jersey was started in 1664 when two noble proprietors received the area from Duke of York. A substantial number of New Englanders, including many who weary soil peered out, flocked to the new colony. One of the proprietors sold West New Jersey in 1674 to a group of Quakers who were set up a sanctuary even before Pennsylvania was launched. East New Jersey was also acquired in the later years by the Quakers, whose wings were clipped in 1702, where the crown combined the two Jerseys in a royal colony. Swedish tinged Delaware consisted only of three countries. Two at high tide, the Witskism goes, and was named after Lord de la Warr, the harsh military governor who had arrived in Virginia 1610, harboring some Quakers and closely associated with Penn's prosperous colony. Delaware was granted its own assembly in 1703, but until the American Revolution it remained under the government of Pennsylvania. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, enjoyed certain features in common. In general, the soil was fertile and the expanse of land was broad. Unlike rock between New England and Pennsylvania, New York and New Jersey came to be known as the bread colonies. By virtue of their heavy exports of grain, rivers also played a vital role. Broad languid streams, notably the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson, tapped the fur trade in the interior and beckoned adventuresome spirits into the back country. The rivers had few cascading waterfalls, unlike New England's, hence presented little inducement to milling or manufacturing with water-will people. A surprising amount of industry nonetheless hummed in the middle colonies. Virginal forests abundant for lumbering and shipbuilding. The presence of deep river estuaries and landlocked harbors stimulated both commerce and the growth of seaports, such as New York and Philadelphia, even Albany, more than 100 miles up the Hudson, was port of the some consequences in colonial days. The Middle Colonies were in many respects midway between New England and the Southern plantation group. Except in aristocratic New York, the land holdings were generally intermediate in size, smaller than the plantation South but larger in small farm New England. Local government lay somewhere between the personalized town meeting of New England and the diffuse country of government of the South. There were fewer industries in the Middle Colonies than in New England, more than in the South. Yet the Middle Colonies could claim certain distinctions in their own right. Generally speaking, the population was more ethnically mixed than of other settlements. The people were blessed with an unusual degree of religious toleration and domestic control. Earnest and devout Quakers, in particular, made a compassionate contribution to human freedom and of all proportion to their numbers. Desirable land was more easily acquired in the Middle Colonies than in New England or in the tidewater South. One result was that considerable amount of economic and social democracy prevailed, though less in aristocratic New York. Modern-minded Benjamin Franklin could commonly regarded as one of the most American personalities of his era, was a child in the Middle Colonies. Although it was true that Franklin was born a Yankee in puritanical Boston, he entered Philadelphia as a 17-year-old in 1720 with a loaf of bread under each arm, and immediately found a congenial home in the urban, open atmosphere of what is then North America's biggest city. One Pennsylvanian later boasted that Franklin came to life at 17 in Philadelphia. By the time Franklin arrived in the city, brotherly love, the American colonies were themselves coming to life. Population was growing robustly. Transportation and communication were gradually improving. The British, for the most part, continued their hand-off policies, leaving the colonists to fashion their own local governments, run their own churches, and develop networks of intercolonial trade. As the people products crisscrossed the colonies with increasingly frequency and increasing volume, Americans began to realize, far removed that from Mother England, they were not merely surviving, but truly surviving and thriving.